Sarah Whitfield stood on the porch of the only home she had ever loved, and she did not cry, because some pain arrives too fast for tears. Rain soaked through her sweater, her suitcase sat beside her on the wet concrete, and behind her, through the frosted glass of the front door, she could still hear her husband's voice telling her that she no longer belonged there. She was 34 years old, and in the space of one evening, she had gone from being a wife to being a stranger, locked out of her own life. What she did not know that night, what she had never once let herself think about, was that the house behind her, the marriage she had just lost, and the man who had just thrown her out into the rain, were all about to be swallowed by a truth so enormous that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. For 10 years, Sarah had lived quietly, almost invisibly, in a modest brick house on a tree-lined street in Ohio, working long shifts as a hospital nurse, clipping coupons on Sunday mornings, and never once telling her husband, Daniel Hayes, the one thing about her past that could have explained everything. She had grown up believing that her father's money had destroyed her parents' marriage, and so she made herself a promise as a teenager that she would never let wealth define who loved her or why. She kept that promise so completely that even the man she married for a decade had no idea that her father was one of the wealthiest men in the entire country. Daniel had always believed he understood exactly who he married. A hard-working woman from a broken home, no family money, no connections, nothing but a nursing license and a stubborn refusal to ask anyone for help. He liked that story because it made him feel needed. It made him feel like the provider, the stronger one, the man who had built something out of nothing, alongside a woman who had nothing to offer but her loyalty. He never once questioned how they had ended up living in a house slightly too large for their combined income, and he never once asked why Sarah handled all the paperwork whenever the subject of the property came up. He simply assumed it was his, because assuming was easier than asking. What Daniel did not know, standing in that doorway with his arms crossed and his jaw set in righteous anger, was that the deed to that house had never carried his name at all. It had been placed years earlier into a trust, quietly, carefully, by a father Sarah rarely spoke of and almost never saw. A father named Arthur Callahan, a man whose name appeared in business headlines across the country, a man worth more money than Daniel could imagine in his most ambitious dreams, and a man who, 3 weeks before that rainy night, had died without either of them fully understanding what his death was about to set in motion. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sarah walked away from that house with nothing but a suitcase and a silence Daniel mistook for defeat. He watched her taillights disappear down the street and felt nothing but relief, certain he had rid himself of a woman who had never truly matched the life he believed he deserved. He had no idea that within 12 hours, a black car bearing the name of one of the most powerful law firms in the state would be parked outside that very house, and that the man standing in it now, so sure of his victory, was about to learn exactly whose daughter he had just thrown out into the rain. To understand how a marriage of 10 years could collapse in a single evening, you first have to understand the 3 people at the center of it, because none of them were exactly who they appeared to be. There was Sarah Whitfield, the nurse everyone assumed had built her life from nothing, when in truth, she was the only child of one of the richest men in the country. There was Daniel Hayes, the husband who believed he had married beneath his own ambitions, never once realizing how wrong he was. And there was Arthur Callahan, a father Sarah barely spoke to for most of her adult life, a man whose fortune would end up deciding all of their futures before any of them saw it coming. The questions this story forces you to sit with are simple to ask and much harder to answer. Why would a woman with access to unimaginable wealth choose to live in a small brick house on a nurse's salary for an entire decade? Why would a husband, married for 10 years, never once think to ask basic questions about the property he lived in, the woman he slept beside every night, or the silences she kept about her own family? And most of all, once Daniel discovered the truth about who he had married and who he had just thrown out into the rain, what would he do next, and would it already be far too late for any of it to matter? Somewhere in the answers to these questions is a warning most people never see until it is standing right in front of them, dressed up as love, as marriage, as the comfortable certainty of knowing exactly who you married. Daniel believed he knew Sarah completely. He believed a decade of shared holidays, shared bills, and shared exhaustion had earned him the right to assume there was nothing left to learn about her. He was about to discover that the version of his wife he thought he understood so well was only the smallest, quietest fraction of who she actually was, and that the rest of her story had been waiting patiently for years to come due. To understand Sarah Whitfield, you have to go back long before Daniel Hayes ever entered her life, back to a childhood shaped by absence rather than luxury. Her parents separated when she was 6 years old, and the separation was bitter enough that it colored everything she believed about money for the rest of her life. Her father, Arthur Callahan, was already a rising name in business circles by then, building what would eventually become a company worth billions, and in the process, he became a stranger to his own daughter. There were birthday cards that arrived late, phone calls that grew shorter every year, and a quiet, unspoken agreement between Sarah and her mother that they simply did not need him. Sarah grew up watching her mother work 2 jobs to keep their small apartment, and she decided, somewhere around 13 years old, that she would never build her identity around wealth she did not earn herself. That decision followed her into adulthood with a kind of quiet stubbornness most people never noticed. She went to a state school on scholarships and loans, rather than accept help from a father she barely knew. She chose nursing because it felt useful, tangible, far removed from boardrooms and shareholder meetings. By the time she met Daniel Hayes at 24, she had already spent years perfecting the art of never mentioning her father at all, not out of shame, but out of a genuine desire to be loved for exactly who she was and nothing else. Daniel was charming in the way ambitious young men often are, full of plans he had not yet accomplished and confidence that made those plans sound inevitable. He worked in regional sales for a mid-sized company, and he talked often about the life he intended to build, the promotions he expected, the respect he believed he was owed. Sarah found his drive attractive at first, mistaking his hunger for direction. They dated for 2 years, married in a small ceremony with barely 30 guests, and moved into a modest apartment that Sarah paid for using savings from her own nursing salary, careful, as always, to keep her father's money completely separate from the life she was building. For the first several years, their marriage looked, from the outside, like an ordinary American success story. 2 working adults, careful budgeting, a slow and steady climb toward home ownership. Sarah handled most of the household finances, a habit Daniel appreciated at first because it meant one less thing for him to manage, and later came to resent without ever quite admitting why. He watched co-workers get promoted past him, watched friends buy bigger houses and newer cars, and slowly, quietly, He began measuring his own worth against a scoreboard that always seemed to be moving further out of reach. He never blamed himself for falling behind. He blamed circumstance, blamed bad luck, and increasingly, though he never said it directly, he blamed Sarah for not being ambitious enough to help him catch up. The cracks in their marriage were never loud. They showed up in small comments at dinner parties, in the way Daniel referred to a friend's promotion as something that should have been his, in the sharp edge that crept into his voice whenever money came up. Sarah noticed these moments and told herself they were simply stress, simply the ordinary friction of a decade-long marriage, simply the price of loving an ambitious man. She did not yet understand that Daniel's need for status was not a passing phase but a foundation, and that his love for her, however real it may have started out, was slowly becoming conditional on her staying exactly where he could measure himself as the stronger, more successful partner in the relationship. Then, 9 months before that rainy night on the porch, a letter arrived from a law office Sarah did not recognize. Her father, Arthur Callahan, was dying, and he wanted to see her one last time. Sarah read the letter 3 times before she said anything to Daniel at all, and when she finally mentioned it, she gave him only the barest outline: a distant father reaching out, nothing more. She did not tell him about the company, the headlines, the fortune attached to the Callahan name, because in her mind, none of that had anything to do with who she actually was. She visited her father alone, quietly, without telling friends or co-workers, driving 3 hours each way on her days off. Arthur was frail by then, but sharper than she expected, and their conversations, awkward at first, slowly deepened into something neither of them had allowed themselves in years. He asked about her life, her marriage, her work at the hospital, and listened with an attentiveness that surprised her. During one of these visits, sitting beside his hospital bed, he said something Sarah would carry with her for the rest of her life. He told her that whatever happened after he was gone, she should never let a man make her feel small inside her own home. She laughed it off at the time, assuming it was simply the sentimental talk of a dying man. She had no idea how directly those words would apply to her own future. What Sarah did not know, and would not learn until much later, was that Arthur had spent his final months doing far more than reconnecting emotionally. Quietly, without her knowledge, he instructed his legal team to look into her life more closely, including the man she had married. What they found troubled him enough that he took a decision entirely without Sarah's input, placing the house she and Daniel lived in Ohio into an irrevocable trust in her name alone, structured in a way that no marriage, no divorce, and no financial hardship could ever change. He never told Sarah what he had done. He simply made sure that no matter what happened to her marriage, she would never again find herself without a place to stand. Arthur Callahan died quietly a few weeks later, with only a handful of people at his bedside, and an even smaller number at the private funeral that followed. Sarah grieved a father she had only truly gotten to know in his final year, still not fully aware of the scale of what he had built, or what he had quietly arranged to protect her. Daniel attended the funeral at her side, distracted, uncomfortable, unaware that some of the well-dressed men and women quietly watching from the back of the room were executives, attorneys, and board members who understood exactly whose daughter was standing at that casket, even if her own husband did not. In the months after Arthur Callahan's funeral, Daniel Hayes found himself facing a crisis entirely of his own making, though he would never have described it that way. 2 years earlier, against Sarah's quiet objections, he had poured a significant portion of their savings into a business venture with a former college friend, convinced it was the opportunity that would finally close the gap between the life he had and the life he believed he deserved. The venture had struggled from the beginning, bleeding money slowly at first, then all at once, until the friend who had convinced him to invest disappeared, leaving Daniel holding debts he had never told Sarah the full extent of. By the time the losses became impossible to hide, Daniel was not just financially strained. He was humiliated, and humiliation, for a man who had spent a decade measuring his worth against everyone around him, was far harder to swallow than debt alone. He began coming home later, drinking more, snapping at small things that had never bothered him before. Sarah, still grieving her father and adjusting to a life without him in it, tried to give Daniel patience, assuming his mood was simply stress from work. She had no idea how deep the financial hole actually went, because Daniel had made a point of hiding the worst of it from her, telling himself he would fix it before she ever needed to know. Pride, more than anything else, kept him silent, and that silence only made the pressure inside him build with nowhere to go. The breaking point arrived on an ordinary Tuesday evening, over a dinner that started peacefully enough. Daniel had learned that day that the business venture was effectively finished, that the debts were now his alone to answer for, and that a friend he had trusted for over a decade had quietly protected himself while leaving Daniel exposed. He said little through most of the meal, and Sarah, sensing something was wrong, asked gently what was on his mind. The question, innocent as it was, seemed to strike something raw in him. He began speaking rapidly, bitterly, about how he had spent 10 years working himself into the ground while she stayed comfortable in a job that would never make either of them wealthy, about how he had always been the one carrying the weight of their future, about how she had never once pushed him to be more than he was. Sarah tried to respond calmly, reminding him that she had never asked him to build a life around status or comparison, that she had married him because she loved him, not because of what he could provide. But Daniel was no longer listening in any real sense. Years of quiet resentment, compounded by fresh humiliation, poured out of him all at once, and somewhere in that outburst, he said the thing that would define the rest of that night. He told her that the house was his, that everything in it was his, and that if she was not going to help him rebuild what he had lost, then she needed to leave. Sarah was stunned into silence. She reminded him, carefully, that the house had never technically been his alone, that the paperwork had always been handled differently than he assumed. But Daniel, certain in his own mind that a decade of marriage entitled him to everything inside those walls, refused to hear it. He believed, with the particular confidence of a man who had never once bothered to check, that whatever legal reality existed, it would ultimately favor him simply because he was the husband, the man of the house, the one who had signed the mortgage payments each month without ever asking who actually owned the underlying property. By that night, the argument had escalated beyond anything either of them could take back. Daniel, humiliated and desperate to reclaim some sense of control over a life that felt like it was collapsing around him, told Sarah to pack a bag and leave before morning. Sarah, exhausted from months of grief and growing tension, chose not to fight him on it that night, not because she believed he was right, but because some quiet part of her had already begun to sense that this moment was not the end of her story, but the beginning of something Daniel could not yet see coming. She packed a single suitcase in near silence while Daniel stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with the rigid posture of a man convinced he was finally standing up for himself, after years of feeling overlooked. Rain had begun falling steadily outside, and by the time Sarah stepped onto the porch, it had soaked through her sweater within minutes. She did not argue, did not raise her voice, did not remind him a second time of the truth he refused to hear about who actually owned the house behind them. She simply stood there for a moment, suitcase at her side, and looked back at the only home she had shared with him for a decade, before turning and walking into the rain. Daniel closed the door behind her with a sense of grim satisfaction, certain he had just reclaimed control of his own life. He told himself she would come back within days, humbled, ready to help him rebuild what he had lost. He had no idea, standing in the dry warmth of that living room, that less than 12 hours later, a black car bearing the name of one of the most powerful law firms in the state would pull into the driveway outside, and that the woman he had just thrown out into the rain was about to become the least of his problems. The morning after Sarah walked into the rain, Daniel Hayes woke up feeling lighter than he had in months. He told himself the hardest part was already behind him, that the woman who had spent 10 years failing to match his ambition was finally out of the picture, and that he could now focus fully on rebuilding what his failed business venture had cost him. He made coffee in the kitchen of a house he believed, without question, belonged entirely to him. He called a friend that afternoon and described the separation in the language of a man reclaiming his independence, framing Sarah's departure as something he had chosen rather than something that was about to choose him back in ways he could never have predicted. While Daniel spent that first day rebuilding his sense of control, Sarah was sitting in the office of an attorney she had met only once before, at her father's request, in the final weeks of his illness. The attorney, a composed man named Robert Ashford, who had handled Arthur Callahan's affairs for over 20 years, greeted her with a gentleness that told her this conversation was going to reshape everything she thought she understood about her own life. He explained, carefully and in full, what her father had quietly built and quietly protected in his final months. Not just the company bearing the Callahan name, but a controlling stake worth billions, real estate holdings across multiple states, and a trust specifically designed to shield her from exactly the kind of situation she now found herself in. Sarah listened in near disbelief as Ashford explained that the house in Ohio, the one she had just been ordered to leave, had never legally belonged to Daniel at all. Arthur had arranged, months earlier and without telling her, to place the property into an irrevocable trust bearing her name alone, a decision made after his legal team quietly looked into Daniel's financial situation and found troubling signs of instability that Arthur chose not to ignore. Sarah felt a strange mixture of gratitude and unease sitting with that information. Gratitude for a father who had protected her even from a distance, and unease at realizing just how much he had known about her marriage that she herself had never fully confronted. Back in Ohio, Daniel's sense of victory did not last long. 2 days after Sarah left, a legal courier arrived at the house with a formal notice, informing him that he had no legal claim to the property and that he was required to vacate within a specified time frame. Daniel read the document twice, certain there had to be some mistake, before calling his own attorney in a state of rising panic. His attorney reviewed the paperwork and delivered the news as gently as the situation allowed, confirming that the trust documents were airtight, predating the current financial troubles by years, and that Daniel's name had in fact never appeared on the deed at all. What followed was a slow and painful unraveling for Daniel, made worse by the fact that word began spreading through his circle of friends and colleagues almost immediately. Someone at the funeral had recognized the Callahan name, and in a town small enough for gossip to travel quickly, it did not take long before people Daniel had known for years began piecing together exactly who his wife's father had been. Friends who had once commiserated with him about his failed business venture now regarded him with a mixture of pity and quiet judgment, and even his own mother, hearing the full story secondhand, asked him pointedly what exactly he thought he had been doing, throwing a woman like that out into the rain over pride. Daniel, humiliated on every front, and unwilling to accept the version of events unfolding around him, decided he would not go quietly. He instructed his attorney to fight the eviction, convinced that 10 years of marriage had to count for something in the eyes of the law, that no court would simply hand a house to a woman without acknowledging the life he had built inside it alongside her. He told himself this was about fairness, about the years he had put into that marriage, though underneath that justification sat something rawer and harder to admit, the unbearable idea that the life he thought he understood so completely had actually belonged, from the very beginning, to someone else. As the court date approached, Daniel prepared his case with the same stubborn confidence that had defined nearly every decision leading up to that rainy night, unaware that Sarah's attorney was preparing something far more comprehensive than a simple property dispute, something that would not just settle the question of the house, but reveal exactly how much Daniel had never bothered to learn about the woman he had spent 10 years married to. The courtroom on the day of the hearing was smaller than Daniel expected, quiet in a way that felt almost anticlimactic, given how much his entire future now depended on what happened inside it. His attorney opened by arguing that 10 years of marriage created an implicit claim to the marital home, regardless of whose name appeared on the deed, insisting that Daniel had contributed labor, income, and years of his life toward a household he believed, in good faith, belonged to both of them equally. For a moment, sitting beside his attorney, Daniel allowed himself to hope that fairness might still win out over paperwork. That hope did not survive long. Sarah's attorney, Robert Ashford, rose calmly and presented the trust documents in full, walking the court through a timeline that left no room for interpretation. The property had been placed in an irrevocable trust years before the current financial disputes began, structured specifically to remain separate from any marital assets, regardless of circumstance. There was no ambiguity left to argue, no technicality for Daniel's attorney to exploit. The house, in the eyes of the law, had never belonged to Daniel at any point during their marriage, no matter how many mortgage payments he believed he had been making toward ownership. But the moment that truly changed the room was not the legal argument at all. It was Sarah herself, asking the judge for permission to speak directly, something her own attorney had not fully anticipated. She stood, faced the courtroom, and said something that had nothing to do with deeds or trusts. She told the room that she had known about her father's wealth long before his death, not vaguely, not distantly, but with full awareness of exactly what she stood to inherit one day. She explained that she had chosen, deliberately and with full understanding of what she was doing, to live modestly, to keep her father's fortune completely separate from her marriage, because she had grown up watching money destroy her own parents' relationship, and she had wanted, more than anything, to know whether the man she married could love her without it. The courtroom fell silent as she continued, explaining that she had never set out to trick Daniel or hide something shameful. She had simply wanted, for once in her life, to be loved for exactly who she was, rather than what she represented. She said she had hoped, every single year of their marriage, that the question would never need answering, that Daniel would simply continue loving her the way he always claimed to, regardless of what either of them had or did not have. Instead, the moment real pressure arrived, the moment his own pride and financial failure collided with his image of himself, he had answered a question she never wanted asked in the first place, and the answer had been unmistakable. Daniel sat frozen as she spoke, the full weight of her words landing on him with a force no legal argument could have matched. Every insecurity he had ever projected onto her, every quiet resentment about her lack of ambition, every assumption he had made about who deserved credit for their life together, had been built on a foundation he never bothered to examine. He had spent a decade believing he understood his wife completely, when in truth, the version of her he thought he knew was only the surface she had chosen to show him, carefully, deliberately, waiting to see what kind of man would emerge underneath his own pressure. The judge's ruling, when it came, felt almost secondary to what had already happened in that courtroom. Daniel was ordered to vacate the property immediately, with no claim to any portion of the trust or the estate behind it. He left the courthouse that day not as a man who had lost a legal argument, but as a man who understood, for the first time, exactly what he had thrown away, and exactly why she had chosen, out of everyone in her life, to test it on him. In the weeks that followed the ruling, Sarah Whitfield began stepping, slowly and deliberately, into the life her father had left behind for her. She visited the company headquarters bearing the Callahan name for the first time since childhood, sitting quietly in board meetings she barely understood at first, listening more than speaking, determined to honor a legacy she had spent most of her adult life avoiding rather than seeking out. She did not do this out of hunger for power or recognition. She did it because she finally understood that her father's wealth was not the thing that had failed her family all those years ago. Absence had failed them. Silence had failed them. The money itself had simply been sitting there, waiting for someone to decide what kind of person they would be once they held it. Word of what had happened to Daniel spread further than either of them expected, not because Sarah sought any public reckoning, but because a story that dramatic proved impossible to contain in a town as small as theirs. People who had once viewed Daniel as an ambitious, hard-working man now saw him differently, not as a villain exactly, but as a cautionary example of what happens when pride convinces a person they understand someone completely, right up until the moment that understanding is tested and found lacking. What surprised almost everyone who knew the full story was what Sarah chose to do next. Rather than pursue the kind of retribution many believed Daniel deserved, she instructed her attorney to offer him a modest financial settlement, enough to help him find a new place to live and rebuild some stability, on the condition that he leave quietly and make no further claims against the estate. Friends questioned why she would extend him even that much generosity after everything he had done. Sarah's answer was simple. She had spent her entire life watching what money could do to people who let it define their worth, and she refused to let her father's fortune turn her into someone who used it as a weapon, even against a man who had genuinely hurt her. Daniel accepted the settlement without argument, humbled in a way that stripped away nearly all the confidence that had once defined him. He moved into a small apartment across town, and in the quiet months that followed, he found himself replaying that rainy night more often than he cared to admit, understanding, too late, that the woman he thought he had lost nothing in losing had actually been offering him something far more valuable than status or comparison the entire time they were together. Sarah, meanwhile, settled into a version of her life that finally felt honest in every direction. She kept working occasional shifts at the hospital, not out of necessity, but because the work itself still mattered to her, still felt like the truest expression of who she was, regardless of what sat in her family's accounts. In quiet moments, she found herself returning to the words her father had said to her in his final months, the simple instruction to never let a man make her feel small inside her own home. She understood now that he had not simply been offering comfort in that hospital room. He had been trying, in the only way he knew how, to protect her from a moment he suspected was already coming. This is not really a story about money or houses or the papers that decide who owns what. It is a story about what people reveal when they believe there is nothing left to gain by pretending otherwise, and about the quiet, patient kind of strength it takes to wait, sometimes for years, to find out the truth about the person lying beside you. Would you have noticed the warning signs before the truth ever came out? Or would you, like Daniel, have been standing in that doorway certain you already knew exactly who you married? Before you go, we want to hear from you. At what point in this story did you know Daniel had already lost everything that actually mattered, long before that judge ever read a ruling out loud? Was it the night he told Sarah to leave, certain the house belonged to him? Was it the moment the legal notice arrived at his door? Or was it earlier than that, back when he first started measuring his own worth against everyone around him, long before Sarah ever walked into the rain? Leave your answer in the comments below. We read every single one, and we would love to know where you are watching this from tonight. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you are subscribed so you never miss one of our upcoming videos. And if you want to help this channel keep telling stories like this one, give this video a like before you go. We will see you in the next one.